Thank you for inviting me to present. I'm going to talk to you about the Art Canada Institute, which is an organization that I founded to promote Canadian art history, research, and education. What I wanted to do was make Canadian art history a contemporary conversation. Why did I want to do this? I wanted to bring Canadian art history into the 21st century. I wanted to democratize Canadian art history. I wanted to make art history and artists accessible to everyone. What I have done over the last 3 years since founding the Art Canada Institute is to create a web-based access to Canadian art. And so what I'm going to talk to you about is about art in the digital age, in the 21st century, and what it means to look at art now, and what the museum means in the 21st century. On the Art Canada Institute site, there are online exhibitions like this one about William Notman, a wonderful Montreal 19th century photographer. So there's an exhibition about his work. On our website, there are online exhibitions that connect contemporary artists to those in art history who influenced them. On our website, there are comments from well-known Canadians like Dr. Samantha Nutt, talking about what matters to her about Canadian art history and why. Here, what we're looking at is a work that she's talking about by the wonderful photographer, Canadian photographer, Edward Bertinsky. On the Art Canada Institute's website, we have stories from individuals who have been critical to creating the history of Canadian art, talking about their experiences and what it has meant to build the country's visual arts landscape. We have spotlights featuring Canadian artists and their most important works. We have essays that bring to Canadians the story of the most important paintings by the country's leading scholars and museum professionals. The Art Canada Institute started with a vision for creating online digital art books available in both French and English. And I'm going to talk to you a bit about why this vision came to me. And it's particularly appropriate following Alexandra's talk. About 7 years ago, I went back to university and I completed a PhD in art history. And it was a great experience going back to university as a mature student because I noticed something. I noticed that most students, most of my peer group at university, they were not going to the library to find their research. And often they weren't even going to a museum to look at art. And this, what we're looking at on screen now, is a picture of the National Gallery of Canada. And you'll notice something. It is particularly empty. Something else that became very apparent to me is that the comfort level that many people have with going to museums is not a comfort level, in fact. In fact, there is a distance between people's entry point and accessibility to art, and then getting into a museum. And I started thinking about why is this the case? And to understand why this is the case, we have to look a bit into history. And the museum and art galleries, in fact, as we know them, they're something that are fairly new in history. They only really started coming into the public in about the 18th century. And this is a very early museum. And the museums actually originated from individual, usually royalty, nobility, from private collections that people had that they would store stuff in cases like what you're seeing here. Here's another example of an early private museum in the Netherlands. But the thing is, when museums then became open to the public, largely happened after the French Revolution, the vision of a museum was something like this: put up great work and people will come, which made a lot of sense before the digital age. But now, if you think about museums And if you think about books, the first place that one is going to turn to learn about art and art history isn't necessarily an art library, a bricks and mortar art library, or going to an art museum, which is not to say that it's not significant to go and see art and to have access to art. As a matter of fact, after the Second World War, the United Nations declared that art is a fundamental human right. But there is an issue, there is a bit of a crisis that we have in Canada, which is that only 40% of Canadians actively access their own bricks and mortar museums and art galleries. So I began to think, how can we change this? How can we start to look at art in an accelerated age, in a 21st century age? One of the things that I did was I looked up on Google one of my favorite artists, an artist named Jack Chambers. And I found a Jack Chambers school, a blog on him, but actually I was able to find next to no research and reliable content on him. And this was a problem for me because while I was doing my PhD, I started teaching at the University of Toronto. And every course that I taught, I wanted to make sure that I injected a healthy dose of Canadian art history into any course that I was teaching. And yet, when I went to the internet, it wasn't there. When I went to the libraries, bricks and mortar libraries, it wasn't there either. Now, I'm happy to say, if you Google Jack Chambers books, one of the first things you see is the Art Canada Institute and the book that we have done on Jack Chambers. So back to the museum for a moment. This is a traditional way that museums looked, siloed in their own independent space. And I started thinking about how did our landscape look when it came to viewing art? And it looked something like this. On the one hand, there were a group of people called curators, museum professionals who worked in museums and tried to teach the public about art. Then there were academics, university professors, scholars who were studying art. And then in the third group, there was the public who was trying to have some sort of access to art, but I knew from the statistics that this was failing because people didn't feel an accessibility to art, they didn't feel a comfort level around it. So I decided to come up with a new vision, with a vision called the Art Canada Institute, where what I would do is I would draw together museum professionals, academics, and the public through presenting art largely on a digital platform. I went and I approached over 50 of the country's leading museum professionals and art historians, people who amazingly had never ever worked together. And I said to them, how would you feel about creating original content for the internet that introduced a broad public audience to Canadian art and its most important thinkers, creators, innovators? And the response that I had was overwhelmingly positive because really, there was a group of people, all these names that you see on screen, who wanted to learn and wanted to teach about Canadian art history, but they didn't know how to bring it to a broad public audience through the internet. And in large part, what I did, I'm not a tech innovator. I'm not a coder. Much like Alexandra before me, I had an idea, and what I said is, what I can do is I can help bring your idea, and what I did know how to do is I did have a strong background in graphic design. I had worked as a journalist, as a traditional book publisher, a print book publisher. But what I said to my colleagues at museums and at universities, I said, we're in an age right now where if you're going to buy a house, the first place you're going to look is on the internet. If you're going to see a film, the first place you're going to look is on the internet. If you're going to go to a restaurant, the first place you're going to look is online. We need to start doing this for art and art history. And it is incredible to believe that this hadn't really been done before, but simply it hadn't taken place. And so what I did was I created this program called the Canadian Online Art Book Project. And since it was founded, what we have done is we have created 24 digital books. This has been since November 2013. Books that are all available, simultaneously published in French and English, both on a desktop version, a mobile version, a PDF version. And all this material is available for free. So in addition to founding this project, what I did was I went out and I found donor support, and I said to donors, what really matters is democratizing art for Canadians, making this subject accessible, because I explained it quite simply. I said that when I see my children enter the word art into Google, what I want to come up is not Vincent van Gogh or Pablo Picasso or Salvador Dali. What I want to see is Joyce Wieland, I want to see Emily Carr, I want to see Tom Thompson, I want to see Lauren Harris. I want everybody in this audience, I want all Canadians to know about their own visual cultural heritage. And so thankfully, I had a great enthusiastic response from art historians and museum professionals. And I also had a very strong response from donors who said, I really like this vision. I believe in it. I want to support you. Traditionally, most print art books in Canada have had a sale of about 2,000 copies. We know at the Art Canada Institute that over 300,000 people use our books regularly. So what that means is that regardless of people's proximity to a bricks and mortar museum, regardless of their level of knowledge of art history and their expertise, all individuals are able to be part of the conversation about Canadian art. I'm going to take you inside some of our books and show you what they look like. Every book was created not as a print book that was then put on the internet. I thought through the logistics of looking at art with my team, a great team of editors, art historians, thinkers, and what we found is we knew that when people wanted to learn about art, what they wanted to know about was an artist's biography, about the key works of an artist, about the significance and critical issues of art. And so for every book that we did, we then followed this similar format. This is the title page of our book on William Notman, the 19th century Montreal photographer. One can either start reading it immediately or one can download it as a PDF to read without internet access. In every book, there's a chapter heading that takes the user through the biography of the artist. This is a visual of what an interior page looks like. In every spot where there was a piece of language that seemed to be what I would call art speak, we make available a pop-up definition of those words. Again, this is to make sure that all have an accessibility, that people don't start to read it and think, I don't understand this, I'm going to go off to a different site. Every book has something called a key work section, where it's essentially like an online exhibition of looking at the artist's work. And all one has to do is go through 10 to 15 key works to understand what an artist's life and work is about. A style and technique section to understand how this artist is different and what makes her work or his work so unique. Here's a look at the style and innovation that William Notman used. We're looking at a glass plate negative. That's something that is featured as part of the style and technique section. The significance and critical issues of the artist, simply answering the question, why does this person matter? Why is this person important to our cultural landscape? As I mentioned, every book is available simultaneously in French, and this is something that is also so critical when looking at art in the 21st century, because Canadian art, what has often tended to happen is that there have been very important artists in Quebec, But the translation of books about those artists hasn't happened to English, so they've remained important artists in Quebec, but not in the rest of Canada. Every book has a sources and resources section, so one is able to do further study. And most importantly, and this has been a really key innovation of the Art Canada Institute, is that every book has a section called Where to See, which then links the reader from the book to an institution. And so what the Art Canada Institute is doing is that we are actually becoming a directory of where to see Canadian art, where to find Canadian art around the world. Finally, a key thing that we do is we promote our authors, which traditionally, actually, academics and museum professionals have not become rock stars, so to speak, in terms of knowledge about their work. But this is bringing those individuals into the 21st century, into the accelerated world of museum and art technology. I wanted to show you another book. This is our Emily Carr book, just so you see how our format is similar from book to book, which is something that our readers find very satisfying. We have had tremendous praise for our work. The director of the National Gallery of Canada said that the Art Canada Institute was the best news in Canadian art in a long time, that the Globe and Mail has said we are breathing digital life into Canadian art history. Maclean said that our content is redefining the conversation about Canadian art for a 21st century audience. So we're very, very proud about where we are going. I want to conclude by going back to where I started by explaining to you that art really is a fundamental human right, and it is something that should be accessible to all. But here is a quite amazing statistic. Only 5% of public museum collections is actually on view and on display. So if you go to the Art Gallery of Ontario, what you're seeing is only 5%. Most museum collections are actually underneath the museum in vaults, like this one, this is a picture of a museum vault. And so where is the Art Canada Institute going? Where are we moving in our direction? We're still a nascent organization. We're moving away from this model, a model of put stuff out there in a bricks and mortar institution and people will come. And we're moving to something like this, building a huge database of all of the works in Canadian art history, so that everybody will be able to have access to the conversation about Canadian art, so everybody feels comfortable with it, and so ultimately we all participate in what is a fundamental human right. Thank you.